Okay, so it's 5:30. Let me just say a few words to introduce our speaker today. Patricia Cortes was also one of the organizers of this online seminar series. So Patricia got her PhD from MIT in 2006 and is currently associate professor at Boston University, affiliated to the Global Development Policy Center. She has published extensively in excellent journals such as JEP or Review of Economic Studies, Jolly, or Dev, focusing on migration both from the perspective of the recipient and of the sending countries. So it's really our pleasure to have you online with us today, Patricia, and the floor is yours for around 45 minutes.
Okay, thank you so much, Simone, and thank you everybody for showing up. So this is joint work with Semiray, Kasoolu, who's at Y Analytics, and Carolina Pan, who was Power for All. They used to work at the Center for International Development at Kennedy School and Harvard, and that's how this started, and that's how we got the data. So I'm going to talk today about labor market nationalization policies and exporting firm outcomes, and this comes from a program in Saudi Arabia. So countries in the Middle East, including Saudi Arabia, have for a long time relied on foreign workers for the production of goods and services in their economy. So for example, in Saudi, more than 3/4 of the about 13 million workers employed were actually foreign-born in 2019, and they work mostly in the private sector. So the prevailing social contract has been such that with the oil revenues, the government kind of subsidized jobs in the cushy and well-paid jobs in the public sector for Saudis, and then they bring a lot of foreigners from mostly developing countries, India, Philippines, etc., to work in the private sector. They work mostly in retail and construction. Now, things turn a little bit more complicated more recently when, because of the price of oil and the growing population, it became kind of difficult to sustain this model. So these governments have been trying to get Saudis and nationals to actually work in the private sector, but it turned out kind of difficult, both because the firms don't want to hire them that much and they don't want to work for low wages in the private sector because the jobs are not as attractive as those jobs in the public sector. So because of being unsustainable, youth employment substantially increased. It's close to 30%. Actually, female unemployment is also very high, and the political stability of countries was threatened. So this program that I'm going to talk about was introduced around the Arab Spring. And it was, I think, trying to control this outburst of protests that were asking for more jobs. So many countries in the region started imposing a series of nationalization policies in the labor force, and most of these policies came in the form of hiring quotas for nationals. And an example is the Nitaqat program in Saudi Arabia. That's what I'm going to talk about today. Okay. So what we do in this paper is we're going to study how a strict nationalization policy affected non-oil private exporting firm outcomes in Saudi Arabia. And the idea, of course, is that these policies are not costless, right? The firms were already deciding on who to hire based on some maximizing profits. You're imposing some restrictions. Saudis might have different skills, and Saudis are also more expensive. They actually impose a minimum wage. So that naturally we expect the firms to be worse off. How much worse off would depend on how substitutable they are, the relative wages, how much they can pass to consumers, the increase in the wages, etc. And we have rich data that allow us to look to a wide set of outcomes. So we have data on exports. We have data on exit rates, both from just closing companies and also companies that stop exporting but could continue producing. We have data on employment decisions, who to decide to hire, both in the composition of skill, nationality, and gender. And then we have some data on wages. Okay, so why do we focus on exporting firms? So this sector is going to be key for economic growth. And a large negative effect on exporting firms can be particularly costly. And I mean, the Saudi has been trying to become a more competitive economy, which especially the private sector is not. And they have put a lot of effort in diversifying and increasing exports. On the other hand, we think that the exporting firms are the most productive in the economy and likely the most reliant to negative shocks. So if they're negatively affected, it means that the other ones are worse off. That said, at the same time, exporting firms cannot pass as easily the increasing cost to consumers because they're competing with international companies, not with the same companies. So that's more of an empirical question if they're going to be more or less affected. We would look at that. And then we do have a data set with value of weight and exports. There's not a data set that exists that have actually production or output for all of the firms, but we do have data on exports for exporting firms. So what is going to be our empirical strategy? So what Nitaqat did was that it put a minimum share of Saudis working in a firm. And of course, it was not the same share across all industries and firms. So they created these cells of a combination of 45 industries and like 5 sizes. And for each cell, they set up a threshold. And this threshold was set such that about half the firms were above and half the firms were below the threshold. So what were the penalties of being below the threshold? There were penalties mostly related to their capacity of and facility of hiring foreign workers. I'll talk a little bit more about that. So the empirical strategy is going to be very simple, and I'll talk later about why we choose this empirical strategy. It's going to be just a simple difference analysis comparing the changing outcomes between firms above and below the threshold. And then I'll talk about how we try to convince the reader that actually it's a reasonable strategy. One way we do it is we're going to conduct pre-trends analysis in key outcomes. So let me tell you a little bit how this paper is related to the literature. So on one hand, I mean, I myself have worked a lot in immigration and wages. This is more immigration and production. How does immigration affect the decisions, production decisions, employment decisions of firms? So it's related to at least 3 papers. One is by Michael Lewis and Michael Clemens, who find that after the Bracero program, which was this program that allowed, I guess, people from South America to work in firms in the US, that after they stopped that program, people were expecting this farms to hire more workers, native workers, and wages to go up. And what they find is basically they should change their technology to make it less labor intensive. And it at the end didn't increase the wages of natives. There's actually this paper by Lewis that basically shows again that the production technology choices that firms may actually depend on the availability of immigrants. So he finds that in places where there are a lot of like low skilled immigrants in the US, firms tend to use more labor intensive technologies. And then a more recent paper by Giovanni and others that find that immigration increases productivity in services and increases exports in the UK. So there's some literature about how immigration and decision productions of firms interact. Now, this paper, of course, is also related to quotas. And most papers are about affirmative action in the US and India, right? Either being like race quotas, in India, both race quotas and gender quotas, but there's not so much about these nationalization quotas that are a little bit different. Now, there are 2 very close studies to this one. Both, one of the authors is Jennifer Peck, and you might have seen this paper before. And she and co-authors in the second paper by Conrad Miller and Peck and Slev, that is forthcoming in the AJ Applied, they look at the same program that I'm looking at. So they're looking also at Nitaqat and the effects on the economy. So the first paper by Jennifer, she studies the effect of Nitaqat on exit and employment in all firms in the economy. So she doesn't focus on exporters. And she basically finds large effect on exit of firms and also employment. So she does find that this program increased total employment of Saudi, but at the high cost of some firms having to exit the market. And then the second paper that is more recent, what they do is, so in Saudi, because of religion and culture, and anyway, women and men have to work in separate spaces, right? And that's why in part there's a low labor force participation of women. So many firms don't hire women because it's very costly to do so, right? There's a fixed cost. You have to have a separate entrance. You have to have separate rooms. It's complicated. So in their paper, they look how Nitaqat, by putting a pressure on having to hire a lot of Saudis, make it like a reasonable investment for firms to actually incur these fixed costs to hire women. And they find that Nitaqat actually increased the share of women working in the economy because firms were pushed to incur into this integration costs or fixed costs. So we extend their analysis in important ways. So first of all, we're going to look at the most productive sector economy, and we actually have data on output and productivity, which they not because it doesn't exist. So we will be able to say something about the relative productivities of the Saudis versus non-Saudis and the costs, because we have data on wages. And we will also be able to say something about how do the firms, who did the firms hired to comply with the quota? What kind of Saudis did they hire to comply with the quota? Okay, so a little bit of background, more background of Nitaqat. So it was established in 2011, actually, and I think it was announced in June, and it started actually working in September. So it assigned Saudi hiring quotas for firms based on, I said before, in industry and size. So firms were divided in 45 main economic activities, and the threshold were set depending on the size. So there were like there's 5 sides. Now at the beginning, for the first 2 years, I think, micro firms that are very small firms with less than 10 workers were not included in the policy. Afterwards, they included them. And within each cluster or each cell, they have 3 thresholds because they have 4 categories, right? It's bands, right? So each firm will be assigned to one of the bands, and they were red, yellow, green, and platinum. And I'll talk a little bit later about the difference between them and the different penalties and benefits of being in one of those. So red and yellow are those that are below, like the main threshold, and green and platinum are above. So the key threshold here is between the yellow and green, because if you're above, you're rewarded. If you're below, you're sanctioned. And this threshold was designed kind of more systematically because it was chosen such that about half of the firms were above and half of the firms were below. The other 2 thresholds are divided between the red and yellow, and the green and platinum, which are a little bit more ad hoc. So just an example of how they were set. So this is for wholesale and retail, right? And these are the 4 different bands, red, yellow, green, and platinum, and the different sizes, right? So if you are a medium firm and you have 17% of our Saudis, then you will be green and you will be okay. But if you have 10%, you will be in the yellow and you will be below. Okay, so they varied both based on the size. And then, so most firms, as I'll show you, would be red, yellow, green. There were actually very, very few platinum firms. So importantly, what are the sanctions or what are the benefits? What does it imply to be in each of the bands? So firms in the green and platinum could use new online services for visa renewal and issuance, and can also hire foreign workers from the red and yellow bands. And this is, I will talk about that later. This is a potential threat to our strategy because there's like some externalities from one firm to the other. If you're below, then your workers can be hired by the other ones. But we observe this, like it's very, very little switches between these 2 types of firms, workers moving from one to another. Firms in the yellow band could not use electronic visa services and face some restrictions on their influence. And firms in the red band, which is the one with that far away from the quota, were actually very harmed because they couldn't renew their existing visas, they could not apply for one, and additionally, they could not open any new branches or facilities. So basically, what the Saudi said is like, the red band restrictions are designed such that it makes it very, very difficult for firms to actually operate in this red band because of all these restrictions to foreign employees, which, by the way, are most of their employees because of the fact that they're well below the quota. So what data do we have? So we have 3 data sets.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Is it possible that an adjustment mechanism is that you change which services are outsourced, such as janitors, and which services are provided by your own workers? So
that's a good question. I don't know how often that is, but that's a very good question. And I don't think we can look at that, right? I can look at if perhaps if we can identify the firms that provide this type of services, right? Like, I don't know, janitor cleaning firms, or I don't know, cafeteria firms, I don't know what kind, and see if they've grown over time, right, in terms of their employers. I think that would be good. But that's a good point. I haven't thought about that, right? Because that's one of getting out. And my guess is that most of cleaning and most of restaurant workers are going to be foreigners. So that would make it more difficult. But that's a good point, actually. It's a very good point.
Okay.
Because I mean, what we do see is that there is strategic in eventually switching industries to change to lower thresholds. And I mean, there's some talk about like ghost workers, that they kind of put them and pay them, but they don't really hire them, you know, all of stuff. You can imagine people get creative too, you know, but yeah, I mean, we can definitely look at to see if the firms like grew disproportionately after the policy was implemented, so that, because we are gonna see that, and that is consistent, but I mean, there are many reasons for that. But one thing that we see that is consistent with what you say, Simone, is that those firms above, below the threshold reduce the number of employees, right?
Okay.
So if you are now outsourcing instead of hiring yourself, your total labor force, but then it can be many other things, right? Okay.
Thanks.
So Nitaqat, so basically we have this data in which that's where the firms report the number of employees by nationality that they have, and they have to report it every I don't know, every week or so. We have it monthly, and then we have data on the number of Saudis, number of non-Saudis, and we have their classification by the authorities on in which band they are. Okay. Now we have COSI data. COSI data is basically the social security data. So we have data on each. This is data at the job scale level, and covers the entire private sector, includes some demographic characteristics and wages. And then it has, like, because it has a job spell, it has information about the firm and the worker. Demographic characteristics, it has education, but only for Saudis, unfortunately, and it has gender. So that's how we can like look at the effect on this composition. And then finally, the exports data. The export data is at the transaction level, and it records transactions for each exporting firm, each export product, export market, quantity of exports, value on exports, and date of transaction. And then we're going to merge the three data sets, and our unit of observation is the firm. So let's look at the firms in Saudi Arabia, and this is just to give you a sense both of just the private sector in Saudi, but also the difference between exporters and not exporters in the economy. So first you have size. So I mean, most firms in Saudi Arabia, and I should know, but I don't know how this compares to other countries, similar countries, or as most firms are very small firms, so about 65% are smaller than 10. Also, I mean, it seems an economy with very small firms, but I honestly don't work on this area, so I don't know if this is like uncommon or not. That said, of course, naturally, exporters are bigger. So the most common size is between 50 and 500, but what you see is that export firms are bigger than non-exporters. Naturally, they have more employees, in part because of the sectors. The share Saudis in non-exporter firms is less than 10%. And then this is when you see like an economy in which most workers are not Saudi. So just about 10% of workers are Saudi, whereas in exporter firms, it's more like 20%. Half of the firms in Saudi Arabia don't employ a single Saudi worker, whereas that's a much lower number for exporter firms. Share below the threshold. So this tend to be, even within their own cell, exporter firms are less likely to be below the threshold, and they seem to hire fewer females than the other non-exporters. But part of it can be explained by industry. And then with respect to sector, not surprisingly, it looks very different across the two. Most firms in Saudi Arabia are construction firms, and retail and wholesale. You just go there and like lots of malls and like big buildings. But of course, in the exporting sector, most of the firm are going to be in manufacturing and retail and wholesale. And about 5% of firms we observe in 2011 in our Nitaqat data set, but not in 2012 for non-exporters, and much less common for exporter firms. Okay, so the empirical strategy. So, I mean, the most natural strategy for this analysis would have been something like RDD or regression king design, because we have like a very clear threshold. Unfortunately, especially because we're looking at exporters and we have very few, it was not possible to do that. So doing some power calculation, it showed that we couldn't identify even large effects. So what we decided to do was a simple diff and diff in which we will use all of the firms. And what we do to address underlying difference in trends using, we use 3 strategies because we're going to compare.
Sorry, Patricia, can I ask something?
Yes, sure.
Just a clarification. So the export data, or say the business data on the sample of firms you're having is really restricted to the share or the part of exporting activities only, right?
Yes. So we,
okay.
So that's one outcome that I'm going to show, because actually what you can see is that there are firms that you still observe in the GOSI and Nitaqat data, but you no longer observe in the export data, right? So they're exporter firms, but it seems that many of them not only export, right? Because I still see them in the firm data, but not in the exporting data. And that's going to be one of the outcomes that I look at, if I observe them exporting or not. But yes. So we're going to address concerns about underlying difference in trend using 3 strategies. First, just to compare more similar firms, we're going to compare just yellow and green firms. Those are just above and below the threshold. And we're going to exclude the red ones, which are like well below the threshold, and the platinum ones that are actually very few. And that's not going to make a big difference, the platinum one, because there are very few that are well above. Then we're also going to follow Crump et al. And we're going to drop all of the observations that when we do propensity score matching are outside the range of 5 to 95%. So that will restrict our comparisons to firms that look more similar ex ante in the treatment and control groups. And then we will show evidence of parallel trends. Okay, so the econometric specification is pretty straightforward. So it's going to be the change in an outcome saying the number of Saudis or the share of Saudis in the firm. For firm I in industry J, we also have information of region. So we're going to include region and firm. And then it's just dummy variable. If the firm is below or above the threshold, then we're going to include region, industry, and size fixed effects. And of course, the coefficient of interest is the beta that is with the below. And as I said before, we're going to show specifications that include all of the firms that also restrict the sample to those that are in the green and yellow firms.
Sorry, what do you mean by region in the previous specification?
Oh, the different regions in Saudi, like provinces.
So what, like, I mean, especially since we're dealing with large firms, right, that potentially have different, what are you looking at, the headquarter or? Okay,
so that's a good question. I think, so in the data set, right, I think I don't know, I think the data set is at the firm level. It's not at the plant level. But it can be like a conglomerate of firms because they're within one big entity, there are different firms. But you're right, I mean, I can present it with and without the region, but if there are firms that, I don't know, I'll have to check. What I know is that in my data set, you know, it has region. So probably it is the headquarters because for each observation, I have a region and that's what I'm controlling for. But yeah, it would be good to check exactly how do they define region if it's a firm that have like different plans in different regions.
Patricia, sorry, another question from Catherine in the chat. What is the time dimension?
What is what?
What is the timing dimension? So which are the that are covered?
Yes. So we're going to look at the difference. So it's the change between December of 2011 and December in 2012. Okay. So it's just one kind of, we allow like a couple of months to start a policy and then look at the effect of the policy for 1 year after. Okay.
So
but it's the change.
So can I follow up on that, Patricia? Sorry, I interrupted you. But I'm worried about the timing. I mean, the program was kicked in 2011, but the Saudis have been talking about it for 10 years before that, right? And there was, as I remember reading a paper where it was actually, it took 10 years to negotiate with the companies to come up with the numbers to implement in 2011.
You know more than I do, but yes.
Yeah, and a lot of firms had already adjusted by 2011. Okay. And a large number of firms had already left, deciding they weren't gonna, this was gonna be too binding. And this paper, as I remember, argued that was the reason why Dubai became such a popular place. All these companies leaving Saudi Arabia went there. So, I mean, all the adjustment you're trying to pick up might have already taken place by 2011.
Okay, that's totally possible. I mean, I don't think there's, I mean, on one hand, yes, I mean, it's, what I've known is that, yes, there were many policies happening before in terms of nationalization policies. It has been in the radar since the 1970s. They have been trying to get something to get more Saudis. Nitaqat, as I understand, was a policy that for the first time was enforced. I don't know about the negotiations for 10 years. I know that the timing of Nitaqat was in part because of the Arab Spring. That was kind of, it was not because it ended the negotiations in 2011, but because there was this big pressure to make this work, because clearly these policies have not worked before because, you know, 10% of the workers were Saudis. They haven't worked. But yes, I mean, I guess we can acknowledge that this could have been happening before. In terms of what we can do, there's not much we can do because we don't have data from before.
So
right?
that was my next question. What is the earliest date you have for the data? You don't go back before 2011?
No, we don't. I mean, in some things we do, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for the Nitaqat data, we don't, because the Nitaqat data started being collected.
But one way of is checking how the firms are adjusting. If they are slowly inching up, the guys who were right around the cutoff, what were they doing? If you have that data, forget the around the cutoff firms, what are they doing? Are they exiting? Are they expanding? Are they shrinking? How is the adjustment taking?
I mean, that's in part what I do with the pre-trends, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, potentially we can do this, like not looking at exporters. Exporters very close around the threshold are going to be difficult because there are so few.
Yeah.
But potentially for all of them, that there are many more, we can kind of go back. I think we have GOSI data, the Social Security starting in 2010, 2009. So I think we can start looking at those that, you know, we're very, very far from, I mean, to see very, very far from the threshold if they're just exiting at very high rates.
Yeah.
Just to see if beforehand they were doing something. Now, that said, I mean, yeah, we do the pre-trends. One thing that we do see that happened was that, and that's one of the discrepancies that I found between this paper and Jennifer's paper, is that she find much higher exit rates than we do.
Exactly.
And it's one of the main outcomes of her paper is that it led to a very large increase in exit rates.
Yeah.
However,
I mean,
more cleanly into the data, because I've been looking at that because of the discrepancy. What I found was it matters how you construct the exit rate. Because what I find is that depending on the identifier that you use, it seems to me that what they did strategically, and that I think that's why she finds very high exit rates, is that she uses an identifier that uses industry, right? And I use another identifier that is more like the commercial record. And I think what they're doing is that they're switching the industry for another industry that is more convenient to them, right? So when you look at that identifier, there's a lot of exit.
I see.
But the commercial record exit is much lower.
Okay.
I think the commercial record is actually, there are many commercial records pair the other identifier, which was weird to me, that I will find higher exit rates in the like more broad identifier. And I think it's because they're actually strategically changing the industry.
I mean, they're probably doing both. And I bet the exit rate, for example, you can look at if they're Saudi firms versus foreign firms. It would be easier for a British firm to look at to Dubai than a Saudi firm,
true.
right? That's one way of looking at it.
If we can, that's a good idea, actually. We can
Yeah.
potentially look at, I don't know how, but if we can find out.
You don't have the
Potentially,
identity, ownership of the firm?
Because I think what you can do is, in the GOSI data, you have, I think you have nationality. I don't know if it's just Saudis or non-Saudis or even nationality. If you have nationality, you can potentially identify like UK firms, right? I mean, if at least one of the workers is with it.
Not the firm by the employees, but by the ownership. There's no ownership data?
I don't think there is, but I'm just saying
okay.
ownership, it's likely, you know, that the CEO of
I see. Okay.
a big company that is American is going to have American like
that's true,
right?
Yeah, that would
so
be
you can potentially, yes, but that's a good point. I mean, but that's, I mean, the exit rates are complicated because I think they have ways of, depending on how you construct them, they have ways of getting rid.
But it's not just the exit rate, it's also the firms will adjust their employment mix, right?
Yes.
And because you're not going to adjust it right then, you just do it slowly, especially with relatively senior people if you're doing that. Maybe you can hire and fire Bangladeshi construction workers easily, but the IT guys and definitely CEOs cannot be hired and fired within 6 months.
That's true. At the same time, given that the Saudi shares of the firm are not by level, right? If you're going to change one, you're not going to change the CEO.
Yeah, but also you cannot find Saudi construction workers. So that's the trade-off, right? It's easier to find the low-skilled immigrants than... Anyway, I don't know, but we just want you to be aware.
No, I know that it's an issue. I'm aware of that, and I appreciate your comments. And I think we can do something potentially with GOSI and looking at trying to identify like foreign firms to see if they're just like living the hell out of there. Because it's going to become complicated for them, right? With the Nitaqat. So no, definitely. Thank you, Shaka. Okay. I mean, if anything, then one will say that this is an underestimate of the effect of the program, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, good. Thank you. So this is the effects on employment. So first, like the obvious, I mean, the measure of the policy, that is the Saudi share. So we find that on average, firms that were below increased their Saudi share by about 6 percentage points, which is relatively high because I already told you that, you know, they have like, I don't know, 28% are Saudis. This increases by about 6 percentage points. Now, that the Saudi share increase, you can increase the Saudi share in many ways, right? You can hire more Saudis, or you can just hire less foreigners. So it's not clear how you get to do that. So what the two other rows show is that they use both, right? So they did hire more Saudis, or at least those that survived hired more Saudis. So they increased by 35% the number of Saudis in those firms that were below compared to those were above. They also reduced the number of, or increased less, the number of foreigners working, right, by about 23%. And because the foreigners are many more, the 23% represent more workers, such that the firms, and back to Simone's point about potentially they're outsourcing, the firm size went down by about, depending if you look at the sample restricted to green and yellow or to all, by about 15 to 10%. Okay, so it was like a sizable shrinkage of this exporting firms as a result of Nitaqat. Now, how does this play on output depends a lot on the productivity of Saudis versus non-Saudis, right? I mean, potentially haven't hired Saudis before because, the relative wages were much higher, but perhaps they're actually really productive such that, your output is going up, your costs are likely also going up. So it's not clear what will happen necessarily with output because you're just hiring different types of people. So that's what we look with using the exporting data. So with the exporting data, what we find is, so we can look both if the firm exited and if they exported, right? Because they're not exactly the same because the firms, many of them seems to be producing for domestic market and also exporting. So what we find here is that we don't find statistically significant effects of exit. That said, the magnitude compared to the mean is not tiny, but we don't find like significant effects. We do find that they decrease the likelihood that they export. So there are 8 percentage points less likely to export to see them in the data set for 2012. Now, they also, when we look conditional on exporting, the value and the weight of the exports go down by about 30 to 22%, right? And then we wanted to look at the productivity by looking at log export per worker, right? Because yes, the firm size went down, perhaps not surprisingly, but not necessarily, but not surprisingly, the exports went down, but they might still be more productive, right? They could produce more. And what we find is we find negative, they're kind of not very precisely estimated. The magnitudes are not particularly small, but we cannot, it's kind of noisy, but if anything, we find negative, right? So it's not that Saudis they're very expensive, you hire them, they're a little better. It doesn't seem that, at least in terms of exporter worker, it went up. It didn't. Okay. Finally, we use data from the GOSI data, in which we have both the education and we have wages. So here we look at the wage bill. So it's how much each firm paid in wages. And again, it's not clear what will happen with the wage bill. They're hiring fewer workers, but they're hiring more expensive workers because they're hiring Saudis, which they need to pay more, much more. So we actually find is that the wage bill went up for these firms by about 10%. We also find that the Saudi wage, the average Saudi wage went down. And how we interpret this is basically how they were complying with the policy or trying to include their share was through hiring very low skilled Saudis, right? That would lower the wage of the Saudis. And that is kind of confirmed by the next two rows, in which we find that most of the hiring was done of low skilled Saudis. So we see a big increase in the number of low skilled Saudis, about 27% increase. And we see very little increase in the share of high skilled Saudis. So my guess is they were mostly hiring low skilled. I don't know in construction if they can find Saudis or not, but in retail, definitely we know that they hired a lot of women, although these are exporting firms. So anyway, and then we have that they increased the share of females in those that were below. Now, we complement this strategy by exploiting the fact that within treatment and control groups, there's some variation in how constraining was the policy, right? Because you're in the green group, but you're very close to the threshold. You don't have a lot of leeway for your decisions of employment because you cannot decrease your salaries too much or you will cross, right? So we're going to exploit this distance to the threshold. So the distance is going to be the share Saudis minus the threshold for the green. Okay, so the one that you have benefits or costs. And just because it makes life easier when I interpret this, the smaller the distance, at least below, right? The higher the share of Saudis, right? These are negative numbers for those below. So we're going to allow basically the distance. We're going to include distance instead of below, but we're going to allow that to vary with if you are below or above. And we expect the interaction between below and distance to be significant. Now with beta, those are the effective distance for those that are above the threshold, right? For some outcomes, it might matter, right? Because again, if you're very close to the threshold above, right, then you cannot change your decisions as much as if you are well above, right? So that's what we're going to do. So this is graphically basically what we do and what we find, right? So for example, let's look at Saudi employment, right? This is a bin scatter, and this is a fitting a linear. Of course, the bin scatter doesn't show like how many are there by how many firms are in each of these points, but when we run the regression here for the line, we do, right? But what we want to show here is, the farther away you are from the threshold, the more you change your Saudi employment, right? And if you're above, there's kind of a negative slope, but much less steep than this one, similar to total employment. So you reduce your total employment the farther you are, and also here, but the slope is less, okay? So here we're showing the regression. So for example, when you look at Saudi employment, right? Still for those that are above, you see an effect, right? You tend to move less the Saudi employment, but the effect is larger if you're below, okay? And generally we find some cases we don't find significance, but in general we find what we expect, that you have to react more if you are farther away from the threshold, as you would expect. Now, finally, I want to look at these pre-trends that we were talking about. So here we're restricted by data on exports, and I'm going to show you the wage bill because we don't have data before from the Nitaqat data set. So basically, we're just going to run the regression of changes in the outcome from being below in 2011 times and allowing this to vary depending if we're before or after for each year, and see if we can see if there were differences in the changes below the policy was implemented. So I'm going to show you exports weight here, and what we see here, the levels are very different. So yes, firms that were below are usually different than those that were above, right? Which is quite not that surprising, but the trends were very similar. And we see after the implementation of the policy, there's a relatively larger drop. There's a drop because there's no drop in the exports for those that were below, and then they look kind of similar. Now, when we add controls and stuff, we find this. So we have data starting in 2008, and we don't find significant difference in the changes between above and below for the years before. And we see this big drop in 2012. So it doesn't seem that there were pre-trends there. Now, this is an interesting part that we're still working on figuring out what this is. So there's a big drop in 2012, right? But it's still negative, not significant, but clearly the effect 2 years later is much more muted. And I think part of this is, there's several explanations for this. I think the most clear one is that the adjustments that the firm made in the first year actually pushed them above the threshold. So actually, when we look at the data, we see that about 60 to 70% of firms that were below the threshold in 2011 crossed the threshold afterwards, right? So then they form, here they're still part of the control group, but in terms of the restrictions or the things that they face, they are like the treatment group in the second year. So they behave more similarly. We find something similar. Okay, this is the balance panel because, firms are entering the market. So here, I'm combining firms that, here is conditioning on firms that we have data for all of the years, and you see something very similar. And this is with the wage bill again, and we find something similar. So we find no differences in the changes in the 2 years before. But for the 2012, we see that the firms below the threshold, the wage bill increased significantly compared to those above the threshold. But then again, they went back to growing at a similar rate after 1 year. So it seems that they adjust pretty quickly, and it seems that the explanation is that they actually cross the threshold to the other one. to the one above. I'm going to skip this part here, and I'm just going to conclude. So our conclusions are the policy achieved its main goal, at least what we see here. And I think this is consistent with what Jennifer found in her paper when she looked at the whole firms, is that Saudi employment went up, but the costs were high, right? So we find that many firms stopped exporting. Firms reduced their labor force and had higher wage bills, and exporting firms reduced their output and productivity went down. I think we also learned that on average, Saudis are not much productive, but they cost much more. That firms complied with the policy by hiring low-skilled Saudis, perhaps not surprisingly, and that the share of female workers increased. Now, unlike in other, so when we look at other cases of quotas, some papers argue that quotas might increase productivity and profits because there's a high fixed cost of identifying quality workers. And once you're forced to go and look to them and you know the workers to identify them, right, it actually increases your productivity. You're able to access those new pool of good workers. Doesn't seem to be the case here. And our analysis explored the short-term consequences. It might be, and this is kind of related to Shala was saying, kind of, but in the future, you know, there are other ways of adjusting that we might not see it here. It might be that now that labor costs are much more expensive in Saudi, they will change their production processes. Clearly, we don't have data to look at that. And eventually, I mean, one thing that people have been mentioning in Saudi is that, you know, these firms were so used to of not hiring Saudis. The Saudis didn't know how to work in firms. They didn't know what skill they required. I mean, over time, there's a learning curve in which both the firm and the pool of workers tend to understand each other better and probably make different human capital investments, the workers or the firms, in how to look for better Saudis, that eventually the cost of this might go down, but that is for future study. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Patricia. So let me, I would like to follow up with two questions and then
Sure.
also as a question. So the first one is, if I understood correctly, you have export data at already transaction level. So can you
Yes.
check whether the reduction in export is due to some particular markets? Because I was concerned about the Arab Spring. So if Saudi exports to other Arab countries, to what extent the policy was implemented for the reason that you mentioned earlier on, at the time in which the demand was low in main export markets?
Okay. That's a good point, actually. Yeah, we can look at that because we do have where, I mean, the destination of the transaction. So we can definitely look at if it's particular. We can look at if it's particular products, or we can look if it's particular markets that were most negatively affected. If it was like more of a demand or supply story, right? And you're saying it's more it might be a demand story. I don't know. I haven't looked at this because I'm not that familiar with the exporting market, but I don't know who the main trading partners are, but it's possibly that they're like their neighbors. So yes, definitely. That's a good point.
And then a minor question following up on your first slide of the conclusion. Can you quantify the cost in terms of foregone exports of one more Saudi job with the numbers that you have?
I'll have to think about that, but I can.
Because I think that would be catchy. I mean, if you could just say this is the foregone export revenues for each job.
Okay. Yes.
Okay. Madeleine?
So this is fascinating because it's just such a completely different world. Thinking back to the question about short run versus kind of longer run effects, I'm curious about these contracts with foreign workers, particularly those coming from kind of Southeast Asia or Southern Asia. How expensive is it for firms to get out of those contracts? How long are those contracts and so on? So that if we looked, 2013, 2014 and so on, would we expect to see a lot more shedding of those workers than the firms might find it profitable to do in the short run?
That's a good question. I think we can look at that. I don't think the contracts are that long. My guess it should be about 2 years or so max, but that's what I think. I don't.
Yeah, if I can interject, it is generally 2 years. It has huge variation depending on the skill level. The less skilled you are, generally 2 years is the minimum to get the visa. But again, the cost of getting out of the contract is minimal, especially if you're
Yes,
very,
I
very
could
skilled.
imagine that.
Yeah, I mean, they can just end the contract and send you packing. The only thing, I was at the presentation this morning, somebody said they are implementing a new policy. I don't think it is relevant, and I don't think it exists at the time, where now they're going to give you 6 months to stay in Saudi Arabia, find a job if you lost your job or if your contract ended.
Yeah, because it was a case before, and that's something that changed with Nitaqat, that you were like attached to a firm.
Exactly.
Yeah, like you couldn't be hired by another firm.
No, you could be hired.
Now you can, but before you couldn't.
I don't know about that. I think when your contract ended, you become a free agent, and generally these guys go through intermediary.
But you have to go back. I mean, unless you find a job. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, you could
you
find a
cannot
job.
just stay there, and you have to do the whole thing again, and I think it becomes a little bit more mobile after Nitaqat because they allow the firms above to hire those from below. But I mean, yes, the situation for the migrants is complicated.
But they all use agents, right? That the foreign workers are going through some type of agency. That my impression is it's a government agency.
No, they're private companies, and they're basically thieves.
There's another question from Giuseppe.
Yeah.
Yes, Patricia.
Yes.
Very nice paper. And actually, I liked your initial reference to, say, the Bracero program and the different papers by Lewis that you cited. I think what's very interesting in your last results, especially the last pictures that you showed, is that in 2013, so after 1 year, there is no difference between the firms that were subject to the program and the others. So my question is, wouldn't that be the effect of a change in technique? Rather, so a sort of endogenous reaction in these firms that they rearrange their production in such a way that, say in the Bracero program, they decided to move towards, say, more capital-intensive techniques. Or in this case, as Simone quoted, he said maybe they switched to more outsourced services. So I think it would be very interesting to look a little bit more in 2013, and I don't know if you have the data in 2014, to see whether the adjustment that you showed in 2012 was just temporary. Probably we are more interested in to see how these firms reacted later on.
Yes.
Say more the long run than just the short run. There was very few things to do right after the program was implemented, unless Saglar was saying that was expected before. But otherwise, we are interested in seeing how those firms reacted to this change in the environment endogenously.
Yes.
Thank you. Anyway, the data are fantastic.
Yeah, thank you, Giuseppe. No, I mean, I agree. I think, I mean, I don't know how to test that if I don't have like information of the technology they use, right? I mean, unless, I mean, again, the fact that they reduce the number of workers is also consistent with more labor-saving technology. At the same time, they're producing less and less productively, so that doesn't seem to be like better technology but perhaps if over time I see that, they are hiring less workers, but their productivity is going up again, maybe that means that they're having better technology. But I don't have technology directly, but I mean, I agree with you that, I mean, the adjustment that the firms can do in the short term are different than what they can do in the longer term. And technology is one way in which they can adapt, or as outsourcing, as Simone was saying. I mean, that's kind of a way of I mean, still the low skilled Saudis are, non-Saudis are doing it, but yeah, definitely we should look into that. But yes, I agree with you.
Okay.
Consider your firm are in manufacturing, so it's important to know exactly which type of product they do, which type of industry they are on.
I mean, that's a good point. I mean, eventually we haven't looked much at, and the sample size are small, so I don't know if we can do something with it, but potentially we can look at different types of firms, right? As you said, I mean, we have manufacturing, but we got other type of firms, and try to exploit some variation in, you know, the availability of using different technologies by type of product, and see if we see different adjustment based on the type of product that they produce, right? I think we can explore that. Try to understand better what's going on inside these exporting firms. We haven't yet looked, and you have given me good ideas, both to see variation by country of destination and potentially variation by industry, to see if we can learn something about what's driving this. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so it's now 6:30 p.m. here in Europe. So I would like to thank Patricia once more for this.
Thank you so much. It was very, very helpful, actually. There are lots of good comments.
Great.
It was excellent. Very good.
I hope to see you online for the next seminar by Toman Basbai in 1 week from now. And thanks to all of you for being online with us today.
Thank you so much.